Okay. And let's see, I am going to start the webinar. And I am going to start co-streaming. Oh, welcome to our attendees. Welcome, very exciting. On this, I don't actually know if it's beautiful where everybody is, but I'm going to say welcome on this beautiful day to Syosset Public Library virtually. All right, it is just about time. So as people come in, we'll let people come in, but we're going to get going. So before we start, just some welcomes. Hi, my name is Jessica. I am the Community Engagement Specialist at the Syosset Public Library in Syosset, New York. We are very excited to get started today on this virtual event. Thank you for joining us. Just a few ground rules before we get going. This event is in webinar mode, which means that the only people who are able to share their screen and their mic are myself and our speakers. That said, we do encourage questions, which and we do also encourage you to hold your questions to the end because there'll be a presentation. However, this is a fun, friendly event, so we just have to put out the groundwork that any semblance of hate speech, abusive language, racism will not be tolerated, and will have you removed from the meeting immediately. However, if you choose to bite your thumb at the screen quietly, we will not know, so feel free to do that. So without any further ado, like I said, please hold your questions and comments to the end. However, you can put them in the chat and Q&A, and when it's time, I will address them to Dennis and Michael. And I'm going to turn this over to them. So thank you very much, Michael and Dennis.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Jessica. It's really wonderful to be here virtually. It's it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's really nice to go to places in person. I'd love to be on Long Island right now, but sometimes with the virtual events, people are able to attend who wouldn't be able to otherwise. So, so thank you all for spending your lunch with Dennis and me or whatever meal it is in your time zone. I am an investigative reporter. I've written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Slate, Wired, other publications, and I'm also author of the book The Map Thief, which is a nonfiction book about a thief of rare maps, and my latest book, North by Shakespeare, a rogue scholar's quest for the truth behind the bard's work. And I'll let Dennis introduce himself in a moment. He's the rogue scholar from the title that I profile in the book. And then I'm going to do a short reading from the book, and then we'll do a presentation together, and I'll have a little bit of a conversation with Dennis about his really fascinating and amazing research on Shakespeare. And then, as Jessica said, we'll open it up to questions at the end. So Dennis, do you want to just say a couple of words off the bat for of who you are, and then I'll read a little bit from the book.
I'm Dennis McCarthy. I'm the subject of this great new book, North of Shakespeare, and I'm the author of Thomas Starr's 1555 Travel Journal and Here Be Dragons, which is a book on biogeography, which is the original subject that I had started studying and which bizarrely led me into Shakespeare.
And we'll talk a little bit more about how all that came to be, but let me just read a short passage. It's just right from the introduction of the book. You don't need to know anything going in. It's really just the first thing. And I'm going to try to share my screen as well. I've got a little visual accompaniment to this reading as well. So hopefully you're seeing my screen now. If not, give a shout, but I'm just going to assume, unless I hear otherwise, that works. So, all right, give me a second here. Okay. It was the greatest party of Elizabeth's reign. 19 days of gut-busting feasts, minstrel performances, bear baiting, Italian acrobats, and jaw-dropping fireworks. All of it was designed for a single purpose, to woo a queen. When Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, planned the festivities at his estate of Kenilworth Castle in July 1575, he was getting desperate. After 15 years of vying for Queen Elizabeth's hand, he was no closer to a promise of marriage than when he'd begun. The Kenilworth Festival was his last-ditch attempt at winning the Queen's affections, and Leicester spared no expense to impress her, spending lavishly on new gardens, gifts, and performances. As the party raged, nobles and gentry from across the realm, as well as commoners from the countryside, guzzled 40 barrels of beer and 16 barrels of wine a day as they pursued wanton encounters in the surrounding woods and fields. Leicester kept his eyes on the Queen, anxiously watching for signs that she was enjoying the elaborate masques and other entertainments he had dreamed up in her honor. On several nights, Leicester unleashed fireworks displays created by an Italian pyrotechnician over a man-made lake that lapped against the western wall of the castle. The spectacles lasted for hours, including dazzling dragons, fighting dogs and cats, and rockets that seemed to shoot out of the water itself. A contemporary observer described them as a blaze of burning darts flying to and fro, gleams of stars coruscant, streams and hail of fiery sparks, of such intensity that the heavens thundered, the waters surged, the earth shook. Another night, the Earl staged a giant water pageant as Elizabeth was making her way across a long bridge over the lake. An actor dressed as the sea god Triton rode across the water to her on a mechanical mermaid. Sounding a trumpet in the shape of a whelp, he commanded the seas to still, shouting, "You waters wild, suppress your waves and keep you calm and plain." After his speech, another actor dressed as the fabled Greek musician Arion serenaded her from atop a 24-foot-long mechanical dolphin. Music emanated eerily from the dolphin's belly, where an ensemble of musicians had been secreted inside. There's no record of how the Queen received the performance, whether she stood stony-faced or smiled and clapped with joy, or felt a rise of love in her heart for the man who had gone to such extravagant lengths to please her. But the moment has been immortalized, after a fashion, in Shakespeare's most beloved play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. In one scene, Oberon, king of the fairies, reminisces to his underling Puck, while in a jealous fit over the fairy queen Titania, using words that might have equally applied to the Kenilworth water pageant. "Thou rememberest, since once I sat upon a promontory, and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such a dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music," he says to Puck. "That very time I saw, but thou couldst not, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid all armed. A certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow, as it should pierce 100,000 hearts." For more than a century, those lines have been read as an allusion to Leicester, who shot a love arrow at his own vestal, England's famous Virgin Queen Elizabeth, at a pageant complete with dolphin, mermaid, and fireworks, just as in Oberon's vision. It's less clear how Shakespeare, then a boy of 11 years old, could have witnessed the spectacle, or why he would have included it in a play written about 1595, some 20 years after the event. In his book, Will and the World, Harvard professor Stephen Greenblatt allows that it is certainly conceivable that Shakespeare's father may have taken him from their home in Stratford-upon-Avon, 14 miles away, to see the display. If so, then perhaps Shakespeare stood with his father upon a promontory, overlooking the lake to catch a glimpse of the entertainments. And perhaps the sight made such an impression on him that he remembered it for the next 2 decades. And perhaps he found a moment to work it into a play performed before the Queen to remind her of her youthful wooing by her favorite courtier. Those are a lot of perhapses, however. It's not the only explanation for how the Kenilworth water pageant could have inspired Shakespeare's comedy. The playwright could have heard a report from someone who attended or read about it in a letter circulated after the event. Or there was another possibility. Perhaps another person wrote those lines, someone who attended the event as a guest and witnessed the pageant firsthand. I first heard the name Thomas North in October 2015. I had been invited to Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, to give a lecture about a book I'd written about a thief of rare maps. The weather was unseasonably warm and the foliage was in full array, with a spectacular red maple lighting up the picture window of the library lecture hall. Afterward, The lecture sponsors, English professor emerita June Schluter and her husband Paul, a literature scholar, took me to a dinner reception. Over a pasta buffet, they introduced me to a scholar named Dennis McCarthy, a confident 53-year-old who looked a decade younger than his age. McCarthy had attended my lecture with his adult daughter, Nicole Golovsky, and only later did I learn that the two positioned themselves around the last remaining seats so that I would sit next to one of them. McCarthy immediately pulled me into conversation, asking me about my book and telling me about his own research in the field of biogeography, the study of why plant and animal species are found where they are. And before long, we were spiritedly discussing maps and geography. As the reception wound down, he invited me to continue talking over drinks with his daughter and her fiance. It took me a half second to decide. I was alone on a Thursday night in a small college town, and the thought of going back to my B&B was infinitely less appealing. I figured I could have a few drinks and enjoy a conversation. I had no idea how this chance meeting would start me down a path to trace a literary mystery that I'd follow along with McCarthy for the next 5 years. We headed to the College Hill Tavern, a bar with old sports memorabilia framed on the walls, Go Leopards, and students and locals drinking liquor from plastic cups. We sat at a chipped wooden high top, straining to hear each other over the impromptu karaoke of nearby patrons. I don't know whose idea it was to order martinis, but amid conversation of maps and Golovsky's impending wedding in the Azores, I was a bit foggy by the time McCarthy finally leaned across the table and told me he had a story for me. You know how Shakespeare used other sources to write his plays? McCarthy asked over the din of amateur Bon Jovi. Sure, I replied, trying to remember anything about Shakespeare's sources from my first year college class. Well, I found a source no one ever knew about before, he said. This unknown manuscript, he continued, was a treatise by a 16th century courtier named George North. The work, he claimed, influenced some of Shakespeare's greatest plays, including Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear. But Shakespeare never read the manuscript, McCarthy continued, as I struggled to follow his argument through a haze of classic rock and booze. Instead, George's relative, Sir Thomas North, had used it to write his own plays. Oh, he was one of those, I thought to myself, a conspiracy theorist who thought Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. But McCarthy hurriedly added that, in fact, he believed the Bard of Avon wrote every play attributed to him during his lifetime. He also believed, however, that Shakespeare had used these earlier plays by Thomas North for his ideas, his language, and even some of his most famous soliloquies. There was something about a murder involving North's sister and an affair Queen Elizabeth may or may not have had with North's patron, the Earl of Leicester, and a tale of familial exile uncannily like Prospero's story in The Tempest. I didn't believe any of it. Where are North's plays now, I asked. Lost, McCarthy said. But so were most manuscripts written in the Elizabethan era. Why hadn't anyone discovered this before? Because no one had the right tools to do so, he said, arguing excitedly that his computer-assisted techniques had the potential to finally solve the mystery of how and why Shakespeare's plays were written. I vaguely knew about the conspiracy theories that Shakespeare was a fraud and the plays were really written by the Earl of Oxford or someone else, but this was something different. McCarthy's theory was more akin to saying Shakespeare plagiarized or collaborated with another writer. The theory seemed outlandish, but I liked McCarthy and was somewhat amused by the lengths to which he'd gone to pitch me. I promised to look at whatever he sent me. So that's how I start my book and leave it at that little cliffhanger, but that's really kind of what propelled me to journey into this world of Shakespeare with Dennis, as I said, for 5 years or so. Just one note, there's actually no portraits of Sir Thomas North, but this is one that I had commissioned that an artist made for us based on some other family portrait. So that's the first actual portrait of Thomas North. But Dennis actually, as I said in the introduction, had discovered this manuscript by George North, and he started sending me all this information. And I was so impressed by how he had used computer software to really uncover all of these links between this manuscript that he discovered that no one had ever known before and many of Shakespeare's greatest plays. And I told him that I would write about it if he was able to publish this manuscript and get other scholars on board as believing him. And he did that. He published this book that actually had the manuscript and a commentary showing how Shakespeare used it. And that led me to write a story for the New York Times, which actually was on the front page in 2018. And it was all about how Dennis had used this computer software that's used for to check plagiarism of all things. And he had compared the works of this manuscript with the works of Shakespeare's plays to show how this manuscript was this unknown source. But that was really only a part of his theory. And it was in some ways just a small part of this much larger theory that he had about Thomas North writing these original source plays. And that Thomas North had actually used this manuscript along with a whole lot of other sources that Shakespeare then adapted into the plays that we know today. And even though scholars were really excited about Dennis's discovery of this manuscript, and one of them called it, a once in a generation find in Shakespeare studies, they really bought into this theory. Once Dennis started revealing the true extent of his theory and about Thomas North writing his source plays, people just really didn't want to talk to him and just really held him at arm's length. And I felt that was really unfair because as he started sending me information, it really made a lot of sense to me. He had used not only computer software, but also other forms of analysis to really hypothesize the existence of these source plays. And it really, in some ways, changes the way that you look at the plays if you believe that they were based on these earlier plays. And so that's what started me on this quest along with Dennis. And we started traveling. We went to Italy and France, and I went to England to do my own research in archives. And I started uncovering things that Dennis hadn't even seen himself that really supported his theories and really started to make me believe that there was actually some truth to this theory. And so without any further ado, I'll bring Dennis into the conversation, and you can hear directly from the source about some of the things that he's found, and then I'll share some more slides as we continue to talk here. But Dennis, after that introduction, let me kind of bring you into the conversation here. So I've talked about how I met you and how I started on this journey with you, but tell me from your side, sort of, when you were pitching me on that manuscript on that bar in October of 2015, what were you trying to get out of the experience?
Well, first, I wanted a great drinking companion. And I did find one. That was great. But it is true. Nicole and I, my daughter and I, did know that you were an investigative journalist, and we were thinking that possibly you might be interested in this story, but that is not the only reason we asked you out to drink. But it turns out, and but the most we were hoping for is possibly a story sometime down the road, let alone one on the front page of the New York Times, and then this wonderful book, which is just absolutely fabulous. And everyone should especially read those last 8 pages, which
where I really sum up the theory.
Yeah.
Well, before we get there, talk about why there's such a mystery about Shakespeare. I mean, I think people, may be sort of vaguely aware that, there's these kind of theories, these conspiracy theories that someone else really wrote the plays, but why is that? Why do people believe that?
Sure. Well, my view is that Thomas North wrote Shakespeare's source plays. He wrote these old plays that Shakespeare then later adapted for the public stage. And the fact that these old plays exist is not a surprise. Scholars have known about it for centuries. There's allusions to these old plays long before Shakespeare could have written them. There's an allusion to a Romeo and Juliet on the English stage in 1562, which is 2 years before Shakespeare was born. And there's early Merchant of Venice and early Hamlet, etc. And when a writer on Shakespeare's life in the 1830s, this really interesting scholar had written that Shakespeare actually used a source play for all his plays. This infuriated one writer named Joseph Hart, who just said, well, who's the true genius of the canon? Who's the person that wrote the originals? And Joseph Hart's essay after this discovery that Shakespeare had used so many source plays started this whole authorship controversy in which Francis Bacon was put forward, and then eventually Earl of Oxford and all sorts of other candidates. And it went out too extreme the other way, where they were saying that Shakespeare's illiterate, or there was all sorts of conspiracies about why Shakespeare was used as a frontman. None of that's true. It's just that Shakespeare adapted old plays, as many other writers of the time did, many playwrights of the time did. We know That's not a controversial fact. We know the old plays existed, and I'm just telling you who wrote them. And so you have these two quarreling groups for more than a century about the authorship of Shakespeare plays, and it's actually more prosaic explanation, and I believe the right one.
And yet your theory does explain a lot of things about Shakespeare that are not really explained in Shakespeare's biography. And this was what was really compelling to me as I started doing the research, that, there are all these questions about how Shakespeare could have written about Italy or written about the law, or, with these complex legal terms, or written about, being a soldier in war. And it's led to all of these questions by people like Mark Twain and Sigmund Freud and Helen Keller and all these people, Henry James, throughout the centuries, that have really doubted, Shakespeare really had what was necessary to write the plays, whereas Thomas North did. So tell us a little bit about Thomas North, and who was he, and why might he have been capable of writing these plays that Shakespeare adapted, as you say.
Well, Thomas North what led what I like to call a riches to rags life. He was manor born. He was the son of the first Lord Edward North, and then he had these wonderful travels until about 40 years old. He was traveled throughout France and Italy, met kings and queens and dukes and duchesses, and he happens to be absolutely everywhere, and not just in the right cities, even in Italy, where the playwright would have had to have been to know some of the information, but even in the right buildings and rooms. He was in Santa Maria del Grazie. The chaplain talks about the lifelike statues, and Santa Maria del Grazie is decorated by Giulio Romano, and there's a famous scene in Winter's Tale in which there's this lifelike statue of Giulio Romano, and people wondered, how does he even know about him? He was written about in England. He's the only Renaissance artist mentioned by name. But there's all sorts of information about Milan, about Padua, about Venice especially. That, how does he get it? There's all sorts of information about law. Thomas North had legal experiences. There's information about war, and there's references to the war in Ireland. And Thomas North was in war in Ireland. And we don't just have Thomas North's passages in the canon, but we have Thomas North's life, and it matches chronologically. If you were to write out the source plays as they were written, that's Thomas North's life, year by year, decade after decade, for 50 years.
And how did you come across this originally? You sort of teased in the beginning how you were a scholar of biogeography, and you were never trained as a Shakespeare scholar. So how did you make that leap and start looking at Shakespeare, and how did that lead you to Thomas North of all people as the author of the source plays?
Right. Before the plagiarism software and all of Thomas North's passages in the canon and studying his life, I first found out that Thomas North was the original author of the first Hamlet when I was going to write an article on the biogeographical history of Hamlet. Biogeography shows the evolution of species and how they change and spread across the globe. And I wanted to show this. This also is true with ideas. This is well known. Memes travel and evolve just the way genes do. And that's religion spread across the globe and evolve. Technology spread across. And I wanted to give this as an example with one of the most celebrated ideas or works of creativity ever, Hamlet. And I wanted to show how all the ideas in Hamlet ended up in England and ended up in the mind of a single person. And as you study Hamlet, just all conventional scholars agree, there was this early Hamlet. And they refer to this, and they know this because Thomas Nash in 1589 referred to this Hamlet and this author, English Seneca, who had written it. And I was obsessed with trying to find out. That's what satirists did at the time. They punned or they gave fake names. It wasn't trying to be very secretive. They often did this with scholars. Nash himself was called Juvenal, etc. So who was this English Seneca that Nash was claiming wrote this first Hamlet? And when you have all these databases that we now have today, early English books online, you have all of Nash's works, who was he referring to? Who was he quoting? You find out he's just referencing North again and again and again as the singer Seneca, and he references other playwrights of the time too. But in this instance, he's referencing Thomas North as the author of Hamlet, and that's what started me on studying North.
Okay. Well, let me share my screen again and bring up some slides here, so we can kind of show people a little bit about your techniques. And so talk about this plagiarism software, this called WCopyFine, and how did you start using that? And you know, why did you start using that as a tool to try to uncover this mystery of how Thomas North and Shakespeare were connected?
Well, Sir Brian Vickers had used plagiarism software in authorship identification, and I read that in, I believe, an article in Time magazine. And I thought, this is perfect. I can find passages, possibly, if Thomas North is the author, the original author of many of the plays in the canon, maybe many of his passages still exist in the plays, and I should be able to find links to them, to his writings, his translations that he did publish, which include Plutarch's Lives and Dial of Princes, his 4 translations. So I put in all of Thomas North's works into plagiarism software and William Shakespeare's, and it just exploded. It's passage after passage after passage from everything Thomas North had ever written, including his unpublished work. And that includes his journal and translations that he had not even published yet. He's using all of that in the plays. It's the greatest amount of passages that one writer has borrowed from another in the history of English language. It's not even close. This is these are just smoking guns after smoking guns after smoking guns.
And let me just show people a little bit about what this looks like. So, it's known already that Shakespeare used Norse Plutarch's Lives for his Roman plays, right? For Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus. But what did you find when you looked with the plagiarism software and you know, for example, in this scene from Antony and Cleopatra?
Right. Well, first of all, it turns out it's every play in the canon, and it's not just from Plutarch's Lives, all of his translations. But if you look at this, the red is the shared language. The red is on the left, Norse is on the left, Shakespeare's is on the right. And before scholars realized, oh, Shakespeare used Plutarch's Lives for the Roman plays, scholars would quote these passages and many of Norse lines that Norse originally wrote as some of the best of Shakespeare's poetry. And when scholars found this, they were quite impressed, and they would say that Shakespeare had met his match with North, and that sometimes in many of these passages, which are the special treasures of Shakespeare's poetry, the palm really belongs to North, not to Shakespeare. And that's a quote from many of the scholars that were first studying it. But you see this not just in the Roman plays. You see this in play after play after play. It's all the passages. If you can see, this is just verbatim taking. And another important thing is, literally, if you were to take and study the most significant example, the second most significant example of plagiarism in history, and I've studied this, whether it's Tristram Shandy or whether it's this recent book, How Opal Maida Got Kissed, which contains many plagiarized passages. It's not 1/100th of what you find in the Shakespeare canon that is originally written by Thomas North. And what was happening is not that Shakespeare was repeatedly and endlessly, if you see this passage after passage, plagiarizing Thomas North. He was just adapting North's plays, and North was recycling the information that he had written earlier. And it's that simple. And there's no other rational explanation for this. There's a subject called forensic linguistics in which they use word strings, common phrases like this, unusual passages, in order to identify authors. And this is the greatest amount of borrowings, of matching shared unique word strings ever found in the history of efforts at authorship attribution. And
take us through this example here, which I've sort of, for the audience, I was sort of going through a lot of the examples on your website. I know that a lot of those were kind of passing, very quickly on the screen, but I just wanted to give people a sense of, kind of how much Dennis has found. But, I think one of the criticisms that people level against you is, oh, well, these are just commonplaces. These are just, if you took any writer, you would get all these phrases and you could match it up with anyone. So take us through this example. I think is a particularly compelling one between North's translations of Nepo's Lives and Shakespeare's Richard II. What did you find with this passage?
Well, by the way, the idea that you can find it between any two writers, I prove it time and again if I'm discussing it with Oxfordians or whatever. I say, well, what's a unique line shared by, or even very rare line by Oxford in his letters that he wrote or the poems that he wrote in the Shakespeare canon? There isn't anything. There's nothing distinctively Shakespearean. By distinctively Shakespearean, a line that appears that doesn't appear anywhere else or appears very rarely in Oxford's letters. And this is true of any other writer at the time or most other writers. You're not going to find unique connections. Here's from North's Nepo's Lives, which he published in 1602. And this is a discussion on griefs of the inward soul. It is a Stoic counseling on grief, and it's teaching people how to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is to realize it's based on a loss of perspective, as if seeing things through water. And then it continues to discuss hope. It contrasts hope with death and describing death as dissolving the bands of life. Now, that exact passage with that language, that exact idea about grief and how to deal with grief, and that it's a loss of perspective and how it's like seeing things through water, is in Richard II, including the line dissolving the bands of life, in which, again, hope is contrasted with death, which would dissolve the bands of life. Dissolve the bands of life occurs in only one other work or anything like it, dissolve the bands of this fading life, in early English books online, or really in history, if you look through on Google, and which is in a little known prayer, but that has nothing to do with grief and nothing to do with this discussion. So it is clear that this passage, it is indisputable, and no forensic linguist would deny this, that North's passage is the inspiration for the Richard II passage. And here's the thing, and while we've got many hundreds, if not thousands of passages, this one's peculiar because Shakespeare would have this published by 1597, and North's translation would not be published till 1602. In other words, North had used his own personal papers, own personal translations in order to write that scene in Richard II, and it was used before North published it.
Yeah. And what I found compelling when I started talking to you in more detail about this was that it wasn't just these passages, as compelling as they are, but it was also elements of North's life that you started finding in the plays. So talk about this this murder of Thomas Arden that happened in 1551 and how that figures into the plays.
Yes, Alice Arden, who is the major character. This woman controls all of the Alice Arden had murdered her husband with her lover, Thomas Mosby, and it became the subject of a play, and she was the main subject of this tragedy called Arden of Faversham, and published in 1592. We say North's plays are lost. Not, this play exists, and it was published anonymously. Now there's so many Shakespearean elements. Many scholars consider it to be one of Shakespeare's first tragedies, and it's in the New Oxford Shakespeare collection of Shakespeare plays. Arden of Faversham is, and the murder in which Alice Arden can't remove all the blood, and it's a tough time. The blood will not out. Is very close, and many of its elements are used, and this is conventional for Macbeth, for the Macbeth murder, with Lady Macbeth as Alice Arden, and Arden is and Macbeth is Thomas Mosby. And how that relates to Thomas North's life is that Alice Arden was Thomas North's half sister. Thomas Mosby was a North family servant, and he knew everyone involved in the tragedy.
And then you found lots of word strings as well in common between this play and Thomas North's work. So I'll just show this first one here, but what are we looking at here?
Yeah. So not only is it Thomas North's life, as with all the plays, it's not only Thomas North's life, it's his sister and his family servant, which are the main characters of this play, but it's his writing. So this, even the subtitle, wherein is showed the great malice and dissimulation of wicked women, is taken directly from a subtitle of a chapter in North's Dial of Princes, wherein is expressed the great malice and little patience of an evil woman. And not only that, in a copy, which thank God for Michael Blanding, like in
This is sort of where I come into the scene.
This is Thomas North's own copy of Dial of Princes, in which he has underlined that line. This is the subtitle, wherein is expressed, you see, then the great malice and little patience of an evil woman. And he does this in 1591 to 1592. And the play on his sister is published in 1592. And there is no other example of this language in the history of the English language. No one else, you can look this now, the great malice. So look up wherein is, followed by or around on Google. If you do around, it'll work. The great malice. You'll find no other examples except for Thomas North's Dial of Princes and the play on his half sister. But there's all sorts of other passages which he also underscores in Thomas North's Dial of Princes, which are also used in the play. So it's Thomas North's passages that he's underscoring in his own Dial of Princes, and it's about his half sister, and this is considered to be Shakespeare's first play.
And then talk about North's journal, which was this amazing discovery that you and your co-researcher June Schluter found. And how does this relate to Thomas North's plays, or to Shakespeare's plays, I should say?
Paul Schluter, let's hope he's healthy right now, and who is the husband of my co-author, my better half, as I like to call her. She wrote Thomas North's travel journal with me. She's the greatest co-worker, co-author, my editor, everything. She's been with me for the last 10 years on all this. He found note, as Paul did, on Thomas North's travel journal. This is in maybe 2015. We already have all this information proving Thomas North was the author of the canon. Now we find his travel journal of his trip to Italy. And there are passages in the travel journal that are used in the plays, and specifically, and it especially makes clear Henry VIII and Winter's Tale, most especially. But it's a remarkable thing. I don't know if you're going to go to any of the passages.
Yeah, talk about these statues. You mentioned them already, but these statues in the church and how that relates to Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, because this was really remarkable.
Right. One of the big mysteries that scholars have always had is how did he know about the works of Giulio Romano, which are found only in and around Mantua. And there's a church there, for example, which has lifelike wax statues, and it's well known to have been decorated by Giulio Romano. And the climax of The Winter's Tale is about a lifelike statue painted that a woman, a lot like this picture you have right here,
right.
that comes alive. And in the play, the lifelike statue is in a church. It's in a chapel, in a recess, comes out, and then it comes to life. And people are wondering where would have ever seen it. Thomas North, it's not only in Thomas North's journal, he talks about the lifelike statues. He's also, on that same day, he goes to, he's in Mantua with the Duke of Mantua, and he's entertained at Palazzo Te, which is the inspiration for the banquet of the lesser gods that you see in Act 4 of Winter's Tale, and all of the people that are in it, including Flora dressed as a, in fact, that's the picture, Flora handing out flowers, and that's how the main character Perdita is dressed, and Apollo dressed as a humble swain, and Proserpine and Dis. All these are right there in these images, and that's where he gets it. And this is right after he meets an honest Camillo. And that was just before, and honest Camillo is a major character in Winter's Tale. So it's just scene after scene after scene, and you discover what the Winter's Tale really is about, and how it's been decorated with all of the Catholic imagery of Thomas North's journal.
And I think we have time for one more example here. This is really one of my favorite examples, but Thomas North's second translation, The Moral Philosophy of Donnie. Tell us a little bit about what this book is. It's a little different than his other translations, and where he would have gone to acquire this.
Well, it's beast fables, but it's as if it's very dark, and it's as if Aesop Fables were directed by Quentin Tarantino. It's very violent and dark, and the framing tale of it is about a mule, the brother of an ass, a mule who's so jealous that a bull has been promoted over him in this animal kingdom, this court of this animal kingdom, that the lion has promoted it. He manages to talk the lion into distrusting the bull, and then killing him. And that should seem familiar, but I don't know if you're going there. And that, of course, is the main plot of Othello. Now the story is Desdemona and the Moor from Cinthio. That's where the playwright got this original story. But the story of Cinthio's story has been modified in many different ways so that it reflects the framing tale of North's Donnie, which is a translation from the Italian. And by the way, North got it when he was in Italy in 1570. And that is the exact setting of Othello, is 1570 Venice. And you see this passage here. He's admitting almost the origin of exactly where this comes from, and he uses it in which Iago compares himself to an ass, and Iago is talking just like the mule, his counterpart in the Beast Fables, in which he's referring to asses that for provender will just continue to work with nothing but provender, and he's not going to be like that, and he's not going to do that. And that story that Iago, this curse of service, is straight from North's passage, and it goes on. There's all sorts of other lines that what the mule says, the Iago will say in terms of tell me not of honesty or dishonesty, tut a fig. That's what the mule says. Iago says, virtue a fig, 'tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. The mule says he's going to work a double treason, and Iago says he's going to work a double knavery. And it's the exact same plot in which he gets both the bull to act suspicious, and he gets the lion to be suspicious of the bull. And there's this murder then, and it's the same thing in which he gets Cassio and Desdemona to act suspicious, Iago does, and gets Othello to be suspicious of them, and sets up the confrontation.
And I just love that idea that, one of the greatest villains in all of literature, Iago, who, whispers in the ear of Othello and turns him against his wife, is the origin tale of that vicious villain could be this beast fable from, 20 years earlier from this translation by Thomas North. But then you look at these passages side by side, and it's just so remarkable. The same language, the same attributes of the character, and it really all makes sense. And,
I won't wear my heart on my sleeve, which is famous. Iago, it's one of the famous lines. I will not wear, for dogs to peck on. And the mule is saying exactly that. And he has disgust for people, Iago does, that actually do that you can actually tell what they're thinking. And he says, and the mule says, as such a, what knows your grace, whether the pen of his heart will not write all his thoughts in his forehead, and spit out with their tongue that they think in their heart. It's the exact same ideas. And it really, you see the character of a very basic character of Iago. And even with some of the psychological complexity in the original mule. But this is not just Beast Fables. These are old Indian, considered very intellectual works from ancient India. Right. And as opposed to writing about exact counselors and king or emperors, or they write instead about a lion and a mule,
Yeah, sort of supposed to be this very kind of educational literature to kings and princes about how they're supposed to act. So in some ways, you're just kind of taking the Beast Fables and returning it to its original purpose.
Right.
I just want to say a little bit about Elizabeth and Leicester because there's sort of, what I start the book with, and I think, people love these stories of these kings and courtiers and queens and princes, and it really you really find a way to kind of fit these plays by Thomas North not just into writing about his own life, but also a commentary on what was going on at the time. So just say, just in a minute or two, just say, what you found about Elizabeth and Leicester and how that might relate to the plays as well.
So the his main patron, Thomas North, was the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, and he wrote plays for Leicester's Men, Leicester's theater troupe. And Leicester used his theater troupe to advance his political agenda, and Thomas North was writing for that reason. Leicester, as you noted, was really desperately wanted to marry the Queen, and that way the king. And she was always putting him off. It seemed almost assuredly they were having an affair, at least when they were younger, into the 1560s and maybe even into the 1570s. What you see again and again, another example, at the time that there would be someone to woo the Queen, another suitor, who Leicester hated, who we know historically Leicester hated, like the King of the Goths, the King of the Swedes and the Goths. You would find a play, the source play for Shakespeare's things, suddenly appear, performed by Leicester's Men that actually attacks these suitors. So that includes the King of the Goths with Titus Andronicus, and the source play for Titus Andronicus.
And the Queen of the Goths is the villain.
It's the Queen of the Goths is the villain, and the entire play is about don't marry a Goth, or else your entire. It's the probably, if there's any work in history about not marrying a foreigner, that's it, and it's specifically Goths. There's the villain in Much Ado About Nothing, which is Don John, the Bastard of Austria, who receives in the play a hero's welcome in Messina. And that's exactly what Don John, the Bastard of Austria, received in Messina, Sicily. And it's clear that no one denies that Don John, the Bastard of Much Ado About Nothing is Don John, the Bastard. The actual historical characters of the 1570s. And there was thought of Elizabeth actually marrying him, because he was such an enemy and possible threat to actually reconcile England with the notorious Catholic that way through marriage. So then there's a villain there. Duke of Alençon is the most famous that you see in the War of the Roses, the plays on the War of the Roses, the early English histories, and you have the villain, the Duke of Alençon, particularly in 1 Henry VI, the first Henry VI, and that's just an attack on the real Duke of Alençon, who wants to marry Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was really seriously considering marrying him, and they make him a coward, and instead the hero of Henry VI Part 1 is Talbot, and Talbot is Leicester's ancestor. So all these plays are not just from Thomas North's life; they're advancing Leicester's personal agenda, and they're doing it in the years these plays come out in the years when at the exact moment that Leicester needs these plays to convince both people at court, and he starts in the public theater and the people around London.
Yeah, and that's what really, I think, ultimately was the reason I wrote this book, and the reason that I find your research so fascinating is it really allows us to kind of reinterpret the plays and see these allusions and these characters to different figures and historical figures at the time, and relate it both to what's happening in the Earl of Leicester's life and also Thomas North's life. And it really, for me, it really kind of enriches the plays and deepens their meaning, and kind of you'd think that Shakespeare has been analyzed over the centuries and there's nothing new to say about Shakespeare, and yet you found something really new to say about Shakespeare and a new way to read these plays. So I know we have a lot of questions here, so I don't want to ignore our audience here.
Questions and one funny comment.
But can I bring you back, Jessica?
Yeah, you can. I'm here. There I am.
There you go.
Would you like me to address these questions to you?
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
Sure. And first, really funny, somebody wrote in the chat, wooing Elizabeth, good luck with that. I thought that was sweet.
She was a tough woman to woo, that's for sure. She was
All
a smart
right.
lady.
The first question says, thank you for the session. I have not read the book, but have heard a few webinars on it. My question thus far is about the specific connection and interaction between North and Shakespeare. Specifically, what happened exactly, assuming there were plays written by North? Then what happened? Shakespeare of Stratford then read those plays, adapted them. Did North have any personal relationship with Shakespeare? And we are assuming that instead of Shakespeare is the singular extraordinary genius and greatest writer who ever lived, that North is all of those things.
Dennis, I'm going to let you handle that one. There's a lot there.
So there's actually, even in the satires, you actually learn the exact story that in late 1580s, early 1590s, Thomas North really had a final falling out with his brother. He's kind of banished from the family estates and is now totally impoverished. And he really, it's one of the things, particularly in the last half of his life, that he had to fight against. And so he had written all these plays for Leicester and he sold them to Shakespeare. Now in the satire, they don't say Thomas North sold plays to Shakespeare. They say this scholar who was broke, who was the son of this seeming lawyer and who was in a falling out with his brother, ended up selling, working and writing plays for a character later named Shakespeare, who is a jack of all trades, actor, playwright, producer, and was running a theater company. So they don't really say North and Shakespeare, but they say Shakespeare and they describe Thomas North. But that's what happened. And Thomas North's plays are not the only plays that Shakespeare adapted. He was producing 40 plays a year. His theater companies were, and he was pretty much in charge of what went on. And there's other plays like Yorkshire Tragedy and London Prodigal and Locrine, plays you've never heard of, but they were published with Shakespeare's name or initials on them while he was alive and in London, and people thought he wrote those too. Those were just other plays he adapted. They've been since removed from the canon because they're not Shakespearean, but the truth is they're not Northern. That's why they've been removed from the canon. But Shakespeare also adapted those plays.
And what I like about this theory too is that it's not saying that there's some kind of mysterious genius who really wrote the plays and that Shakespeare, was this kind of illiterate, fraud or something. It really does give Shakespeare some credit, and it's a question of how much credit. But as the adapter of these plays, and maybe he sort of took these courtly plays that North wrote and made them into, these plays in the public theater that really, are still bringing in audiences today in Shakespeare in the Park all over the world. And so there's a room for Shakespeare being a genius of his own, but more as a producer or an adapter or an impresario, whereas North maybe was the originator of these stories. So it's you can have it both ways.
Right. It's J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings.
Exactly, right.
Excellent. Okay. The next question is, this is so fascinating, but it makes sense. Some people connect Romeo and Juliet to Pyramus and Thisbe, but early Romeo and Juliet actually used those names. I guess the question is, were the names actually Romeo and Juliet in the early Romeo and Juliet play?
Yeah, there's a legend, long legend. His name was Romeo Romeus and Julietta. And the one name, his last name was changed. It was Romeo's Montecchi was changed to Montague, and Montague is the person, and it's named after really the Viscount Montague, or at least connected with the Viscount Montague. And North had traveled to Italy in 1555. He's one of the characters in Thomas North's journal, and it seems like the name was changed. North changed it for him. And by the way, they don't even have a candidate for these early plays, like the pre-1562 Romeo and Juliet, the one which almost certainly had the name Montague, Romeo Montague. Scholars don't even have a candidate. They don't even know who, but Thomas North had traveled Italy by that time, traveled with the Montague, and there's all sorts of passages from his 1557 work in Romeo and Juliet. So, I mean, it's a really obvious answer of who wrote it.
Yeah, it's really this stuff gets so confusing, and I had to just get up to speed on all this myself. That Dennis sort of speaks so fluently in, but essentially there was this Italian tale from I think the 1550s, and so that one had Romeo and Juliet, but it was Juliet Capoletta and Romeo Montecchi, and then North could have acquired this tale and this journey that he took in 1555, in which he was accompanied by this Lord Montague, and so it's either a big coincidence or it really makes sense, and then in the 1560s there's actually a reference to an early play that was written that Romeo and Juliet is based on today. So again and again, you see these real kind of connections and coincidences, or Dennis is really onto something here.
Right. And at a wedding of Lord Montague's children in 1572, a passage was written for it in which they compare the Capulets and Montagues. They clearly reference the Romeo and Juliet story to this English Montague, and they even echo the opening sonnet in the prologue in Romeo and Juliet in that passage in 1572. Shakespeare's 6 years old at that time, 8 years old at that time. And,
Wow.
and I really do want to address that Richard II question. I believe Rob did.
Yeah, let me read that. Another question, the point just made on Richard II helped me understand the reference to Bands of Grief in 1597 is 5 years before Nepos lives. So according to the theory, somehow Shakespeare adapted something pre-published by North and included it in the play. I think this is a bit confusing.
Sorry, I'm sure it was. Sorry about that. These are all great questions. So Thomas North would write his translations out long. These are massive books, tend to be, for many, many years before he then published them. So the fact is that Thomas North's passage on it was the inspiration for the play passage. So what I am claiming is that Thomas North wrote Richard II in the 1590s, in the mid 1590s, he revised it actually, adding that passage. Shakespeare then adapted it, performed it, sold it. Then after that, Thomas North published his translation. So it looks like the passage in Richard II is somehow quoting and following a passage not yet published that wouldn't be published till 5 years later. He can't say, well, okay, maybe Thomas North is following the play. No, we know that's not true because we have the French translation that he worked from, and the French translation is clearly the inspiration for the passage that North wrote. So it has to go in this chronological order: the French translation, Thomas North's own personal rendition of the translation, and then the passage in Richard II. And whoever wrote that passage in Richard II had to have access to Thomas North's personal papers on the subject.
That's
And I will
great. Yeah, that was really great.
Yeah, and I will say this stuff, it's hard to sort of present it in an hour-long presentation. It can get confusing, but what I really try to do in the book is really kind of bring these stories alive. And Dennis and I, as I mentioned, actually travel across France and Italy together, and I sort of weave in this travelogue that we're sort of visiting some of these places that Thomas North journeyed to, and I'm sort of weaving in the history of Queen Elizabeth and Leicester and all these lords, and then at the same time bringing in these examples of these passages. So it was quite a feat. There were many rewrites to try to make that happen, but I really try to present it in a way that's fun and readable, and really takes you on this crazy journey along with this really captivating researcher in Dennis.
Okay, let's see. We'd already did that one. Last question, if I can ask one more. I've heard mentioned several times in previous podcasts on this book about a reaction from Stratfordians, but regarding the proverbial authorship question. This theory is a lot more compatible with the Stratford traditional story. For example, Shakespeare really wrote plays but borrowed ideas, language, and texts, versus the Oxfordian theory. Not sure why there is not similar reaction by Oxfordians, since this theory has apparently nothing to do with the Earl of Oxford at all.
Oh, there's hostile reaction. There's more. I've probably received just a little more hate from Oxfordians. Some of them have been great, and some of them jumped on, and some of them, many Oxfordians have been very kind and open-minded, and like, oh my God, and have been willing to. They've got to encompass all this new information, particularly the hundreds of passages that are borrowed from Thomas North's life. But there have been some Oxfordians who have been as bad, if not worse, than the worst Stratfordians. Just very hostile.
Well, it's interesting because, Dennis is really sort of a man without a country here, because the Stratfordians don't like him because, he's saying Thomas North wrote these source plays. The Oxfordians don't like him because he's saying that, it wasn't the Earl of Oxford writing these plays. But, I think that there is this kind of emotionality that people have around Shakespeare, which is really, I talk about this in the book as well, that, I think people get so attached to this idea of Shakespeare as this singular genius, or Oxford is this singular genius. And what I think is really fascinating about this is it's really a story about collaboration and about, how great art is sort of being formed from a number of sources coming together. And that's really much more consistent with the way that I think about creative work. And you think of great movies that are the product of a writer and a director and actors, and even a book has an editor that you work with very closely. And so it really makes a lot of sense to me. But it's been an uphill road for Dennis to try to convince people on either side of the Stratfordians or the anti-Stratfordians. So I think it's really the people who sort of don't have a dog in the fight that have been much more interested and compelled by these theories.
Do we have time for just one more? I know Rob thanked you, and somebody else said the book is revealing, but also a great read. Somebody says the name Romulus was changed to Romeo. Last word of the play is Romeo, ending in EO. Edward Oxford. Interesting. I mean, it's this has been great. I want to thank everybody for participating. And of course, we would love to thank Michael and Dennis for giving us such a wonderful lunch hour, or whatever break it is you're on. This event will be available on playback on the Syosset Library's trending page, Facebook, and will shortly, sometime next week, be available for playback on the Syosset Library's YouTube page. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day. I love the picture you used for Richard II. Was that David Tennant playing Richard II? I saw that. That was
cool. Really?
I saw that at Brooklyn Academy of Music, and that was a fabulous play. So yes.
Yeah, he's an amazing Shakespearean actor.
Yeah.
All right, everybody have a wonderful day, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye.